Well, thank you all for coming. We have a few topics to discuss today, and I'm eager to hear from all of you about how the economy looks from your perspective and your forecast for the next few months. We're particularly interested, obviously, in the issue of hiring and how we're putting Americans back to work. And I'm also going to be focused on hearing from you your recommendations in terms of how we can increase exports in the years to come, because we know that if we are selling products overseas and not just purchasing products and services, then that is going to directly benefit the growth of our economy. I do want to say a few words quickly about the issue of Wall Street reform. I know that some of you have worked in the financial industry or been leading financial regulators. Many of you have been advocates of reform for some time. Paul and Bill in particular have been active in this area for more years than they probably care to remember. As I've said before, we need a strong and healthy financial sector to grow jobs and our economy. And it's exactly because of the centrality and importance of the financial sector that we have to act. The devastating recession that we just went through offered a very painful lesson in what happens when we don't have adequate accountability and transparency and consumer protection. We can't allow history to repeat itself. Never again should American taxpayers be forced to step in and pay the price for the irresponsibility of speculators on Wall Street who made risky bets with the expectation that taxpayers would be there to break their fall. And we can't leave in place a tattered set of rules that will allow another crisis to develop without the tools to deal with it. And that's why I expect that we are going to have a strong reform proposal that demands new accountability from Wall Street and provides new protections for consumers. This is reform that will force banks and financial institutions to pay for bad decisions that they make and not have taxpayers pay for those bad decisions. And that means no more bailouts. This reform would also bring new transparency and accountability to the derivatives market. And this is something that Paul Volcker spoke publicly about just the other week. The derivatives markets, where a lot of the big risky financial bets by companies like AIG took place. There are literally trillions of dollars sloshing around this market that basically changes hands under the cover of darkness. When things go wrong, as they did in AIG, they can bring down the entire economy. And that's why we've got to bring more transparency and oversight when it comes to derivatives and bring them into a framework in which everybody knows exactly what's going on, because we can't afford another AIG. Now, let's be honest, some in the industry are not happy with the prospect of these reforms. We've seen the usual army of lobbyists dispatched up on Capitol Hill. They have found some willing allies on the other side of the aisle in Congress who've been trying to carve out a lot of exceptions and special loopholes so that folks on Wall Street can keep making these risky bets without any oversight. I hope that we can pass a bipartisan bill. But bipartisanship cannot mean simply allowing lobbyist-driven loopholes that put American taxpayers at risk. That would not be real reform. So in the coming weeks, every member of Congress is going to have to make a decision. Are they going to side with the special interests and the status quo, or are they going to side with the American people? And anyone who opposes this reform is going to be leaving taxpayers on the hook if a crisis like the one that we've just seen ever happens again. And I consider that unacceptable. My hope and belief is that all of us, Democrats and Republicans, are going to be able to find some common ground on this issue and move it forward. It is too important to become bogged down in the same partisan gridlock and politics that we've seen. It's time that we demanded accountability from Wall Street and protections for consumers so that we don't find ourselves in this same mess again. All right? So with that, we're going to officially convene the meeting, which will be live streamed. Let's clear out the room a little bit.
Thank you, guys.
Everybody's much better behaved than usual.
Making progress.
Yeah, obviously. Usually I get at least one shouted question. Okay. This time everybody was very well behaved. That was good.
Friday afternoon.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what's going on.
Mr. President, can I ask you?
Go ahead, go ahead.
If you would veto legislation if the derivatives language isn't as strong as what Senator Dodd has?
I want to see what emerges, but I will veto legislation that does not bring the derivatives market under control and some sort of regulatory framework that assures that we don't have the same kind of crisis that we've seen in the past. Okay. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our chairman, Mr. Paul Volcker.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, but let me just say I'm feeling more optimistic about the regulatory front. We've been showing the administration some very strong leadership, and I think things have a good chance of coming together. But there is a lot of lobbying on the other side, as you are well aware of, maybe most particularly on the derivatives question. But we've been talking about exports. There was quite a challenge in your State of the Union message. I jumped a little bit when you said going to double the exports in 5 years. I figured out what the compound annual growth rate there means. I said, my God, what's the guy want from us? But you know, and I mean, we all know that getting exports up and getting the trade balance down is a critical factor in not only getting the economy out of the recession, but keeping it on a stable course in the future where we're not dependent upon all this foreign financing. You got a couple of people on your advisory board that are experts on exporting. So I think I will let them talk. I mean, it really is, they make it actually sound believable that we're going to double our exports. Jeff, you want to say?
Right, Mr. Chairman, thanks. Mr. President, I'd start by just saying we see signs of the economy getting better. You know, the early indicators we look at, things like revenue passenger miles, freight loadings, appliance sales, credit losses have peaked. So we're in the early signs, and we see encouraging signs. I think companies like Caterpillar and GE are planning to hire people in the U.S. again, and we feel optimistic about that. The last thing I would add is that there's really an unprecedented amount of cash on companies' balance sheets today. And the difference between this being a small recovery versus a more robust recovery, I think, is in that the confidence that business has to invest back in this country, and because the cash is there, the capital exists. Now, one of the things that can drive that, I think, are exports. You know, the 60% of GE is outside the United States. We've doubled exports in the last 5 years from 9 to about 20 billion. So it ain't easy, but I'm here to say it can be done. Our competitors are China, Germany, Japan. They take it seriously, from the president of the country through the business community. So we've got to look at that, and we've got to look at some of the new regions like Africa and Brazil, India, those places where I think we can play to win. This is not just about big companies. Small companies benefit as well. When we ship a locomotive, there's 1,300 suppliers for every locomotive we make. These are small businesses in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, around the country. So this is big and small. And like I said, this is, for a company like ours, there's 1 billion new consumers in the emerging markets. That's our target. Our target is to take the company, the U.S. brand. People like buying from American companies, and we think we can sell in every corner of the world. But you know, we love this initiative. We think this is a rallying cry. It's got broad support in the business community. It seems to be something we all agree on, and we ought to go for it. I'll give you 4 quick ideas, and I think Jim's got other things that we can do to drive it. Let's make XM a real weapon. I think we know Fred. We've increased XM has been more flexible, but I think on a relative basis we're still dwarfed by Canada, Japan, other countries, and XM can be a tremendous weapon. We need to get our salespeople, the export promotion people, our salespeople. We need more of them, and we need them in different places. Too many are in Western Europe. There's not enough in Latin America and Africa, the places that we need in the future. So we've got to redeploy the export control people. I think just streamlining, this one's controversial, but streamlining business visas. You know, it takes us 1 to 3 days to get a visa to go to China. It takes them 30 days to get a visa to come here. We want to encourage foreign direct investment in the United States. These countries have been great at encouraging foreign direct investment. And in some ways, Mr. President, it's just symbolic of the fact that we're open for business and
So streamlining them being able to.
them being able to come here. And I think that's, and then the last one I would say is to modernize export controls. Most of this trade is already with our allies. This is something that Secretary Locke has talked about. We think there's a couple 100,000 jobs just if we streamlined export controls and had access. And we understand why it exists. Nobody wants to dodge the rules, but we think that's important as well. I think Jim's going to talk about trade negotiations and free trade agreements, but we are a net exporter to the people that we have trade agreements with, and the more of those we can have, the better. The Chinese are every place. So I would wrap up my comments just by saying I think the initiative is a good one. It will create jobs in big and small businesses, and I think it's one where having a very broad initiative and one that's led by you sends a different signal to the rest of the world.
Before, Paul, you call on the next person, I just want to amplify what's already been said. We think that we've got a great team to help lead and drive this export promotion. And so you've already mentioned Gary Locke, Secretary of Commerce, Fred Hochberg at the Export-Import Bank. I have charged them with making this happen. And what I've also said is that at the highest levels here in the White House, we will be supportive of their efforts. And one of the things that we want to do is be out there selling America and selling American companies and letting everybody know that we're ready to do business. We've got great products. We've got great services. And in addition to formal trade agreements, I don't think that we've done enough in terms of just advocacy on behalf of U.S. companies, and that's something that we want to see changed over the next several years. So, Gary and Fred are going to be following up with each and every one of you to make sure that is happening.
We've got another great exporter sitting down there, Jim Owens. He's kind of got upbeat now these days too, right?
Well, Mr. President, I'm delighted to be here today and to actually bring you some good news for a change. We've got a pretty tough year last year, but certainly positive news on the export job creation side. And I, too, really salute your initiative to double exports. And I think Caterpillar's another terrific example. Over the 5-year period ended in 2008, we more than doubled our exports globally. We were at $16 billion that year. Drives a lot of our employment in the United States and is critically important to our economic health. A lot of people think of us as a bit of a global bellwether because we do operate all over the world, and I've just come back from some pretty extensive travels in Asia. Our financial release is out next week, so I can't be overly specific here, but I will say our exports were down slightly in the first quarter compared to a year ago, and our latest projections are that our exports this year will be up 65%. Wow. So the late 2008, early 2009 economic stabilization stimulus packages around the world are having a pretty profound positive impact. I think we're going to find a stronger global economic recovery than many people expect, and we're seeing a pretty sharp V in demand for a lot of our products, particularly in the commodity-related space. But the big demand is coming from the global market theater. Led in Asia certainly by India, China, and Indonesia, the ASEAN group, but Brazil and the west coast of South America, parts of the Middle East, Russia, everybody who produces commodities. And these stimulus initiatives they've taken very focused on infrastructure investment, which they need a lot of, is driving demand for our products. But the mega trend of an emergent middle class and urbanization in these rapidly growing countries is creating a tremendous export opportunity for U.S. companies going forward. Interestingly enough, last year was the first year we exported more to emerging markets than to our traditional OECD country competitors. We've been operating globally for a very long time. As you know, last year we had, unfortunately, headline news of horrific layoffs, and very disappointing. We did maintain our financial strength. We maintained our investment focus on new product technologies. This year, the exports alone will allow us to recall over 3,000 employees in the U.S. as we can currently see it. And we think our suppliers, direct suppliers in the U.S. will recall between 9,000 and 10,000.
That's great.
So I'm very encouraged by that. Certainly, it's a lot more fun to be hiring than laying off people.
Absolutely.
And I think the economy is turning. Just in the way of recommendation, I think we're pretty well known for being very strong supporters of trade agreements. I think the 3 pending FTAs with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, if we could move those through the Congress and get passage, it would send a tremendously positive message that our country's open for business. And I think we need to restart and successfully lead getting a Doha round of trade negotiations. That's a little longer term initiative. But the world needs the WTO structure. And it's dangerous. There's been a number of protectionist measures put in place around the world over the last period of economic trauma we've all gone through. We need to get back to leadership there, and I think the United States is the country that can do that. And finally, on the tax side, I know there's been a lot of discussion about that, but we need to pay our fair share of taxes, totally agreed. But a territorial tax system, which most of our major trading partners have, if we went to that system, we would free up hundreds of billions of dollars, which would flow back to the United States and create investment, I believe, in our own country and more research and engineering here. These are our key competitive strengths. It's a very complex area, I recognize. And the other recommendation, and Jeff touched on it, as I travel the world, I can't go to India or China or Indonesia without a strong sales pitch, not only from the national government, but certainly at the local, provincial level. We'd like to build tractors here, and really encouraging foreign direct investment. We need to do a better job of encouraging foreign direct investment in our country. It creates jobs here, it's import substitution, it creates meaningful employment and a tax base. Most every American company CEO that I know and spend time with, and it's quite a few of them, are confident we can compete and win given a level playing field. And the kind of recommendations that I'm making, I think, are really about creating a level playing field for American manufacturers and service providers around the world.
Thank you.
But thank you very much.
It's fair to say that just in all contacts, there's a lot of opinion on this group about the free trade agreements and the fact that corporate taxes, the international tax business is a mess and it needs a review. I don't know what the answer is, but it sure does need a review. I think that's generally.
Well, let me just comment on these two issues. I'm on record as saying I want to complete these trade agreements.
And I'd love to help you get the business community to help.
To do that, things have to get through Congress. That requires, as I think all of you observed over the last year and a half, quite a bit of work. But this is something that we believe in and we want to continue to pursue. With respect to the tax system, you're right, it's complicated. I think our goal here has been to create a level playing field. The challenge is to create a level playing field both between our international companies and foreign companies, but also a level playing field between companies located primarily in the United States and producing and hiring in the United States and companies that are doing so overseas. And trying to find that right balance is not easy, but we've been listening very carefully to the concerns of companies like yours, Jim, and I think that we are arriving at a balance that is appropriate. But we're going to continue to work with this team in terms of doing that. And I know some of you individually are going to have some recommendations on
Marty Feldman,
tax
to say a word or two about the tax.
Not about the tax thing, no. I mean, I wanted to say something else. Well, I wanted to make a general economic point about exports, because in any country, being able to have net exports, and of course it's net exports that create jobs, exports minus imports, requires that national saving exceed national investment, that the saving of households and businesses minus the dissaving of the government has to exceed investment in plant and equipment and housing. If that happens, then there's excess output that can be exported. And right now, we're in the opposite position, where our saving rate is less than our investment in plant and equipment and in housing. And Germany and China are in the opposite position, where they're saving more. So despite all the individual initiatives, the only way we're going to get net exports up is to deal with national saving in the years ahead. And as you know, the big uncertainty about that is what's going to happen to the fiscal deficit, because the projected fiscal deficits over the coming decade would absorb almost all of the saving of households and businesses at current rates. So that has to be high on the
Let's
list.
solve the
Dealing with
deficit
this
for
problem.
the next meeting.
Next meeting.
I do want to say something about this. Obviously, the national savings rate has to go up, and we're going to have to get deficits under control. We've got a fiscal commission that's working diligently to start putting in place a medium and long-term plan. This group, I suspect, will have some strong opinions in terms of how we approach it. And I'll be interested in hearing those opinions in a separate meeting. But suffice to say that if we are continuing along the path that we're on now, then you're right, Marty, we can make some progress in terms of individual companies, but we're not going to be making progress as a whole. Now, the one other aspect of this I'd raise, just because you mentioned China, Germany, and some other countries, part of this global rebalancing is that they're going to have to make some decisions as well about how they are approaching their domestic markets. And part of the bargain that I think we're trying to strike within the G20 framework is to say, look, we've got to take on our responsibilities in terms of improving our savings rate. You, on the other hand, have to recognize that a purely export-driven strategy of economic growth is not going to work, given that American consumers are just not going to be in the same position, and the American government's not going to be in the same position that it's been over the last several years. One last point I want to make before we move on. Somebody mentioned export controls. I think you're aware that we are going through a very thorough reevaluation of our export controls. A lot of them are outdated. Some of them are carryovers to the Cold War. We are losing business opportunities unnecessarily, but we're also, I actually think, impeding effective monitoring of our national security, because if you have export controls across everything, then you're not spending time focusing on the handful of things that really do touch on sensitive national security issues. And so that's something that I expect we're going to have a formal report. Bob Gates is leading that directive. It's going to be entirely grounded in our national security needs, but I think we'll have a strong potential impact on where we can go in terms of exports. So, Paul.
Me? Mr. President, first of all, I want to say I think you're doing a terrific job in our relations with China. It's obviously quite complicated, but one of the topics I wanted to talk about was equal trade and the need for those of us who are exporters to really have a quid pro quo in our trade terms on a country-by-country basis. Obviously, exchange rates being the first issue, and needing exchange rates to be market determined. And obviously, some countries pegging their currency to the dollar is a very dangerous way to do trade. And I know you've been working very hard on this. And our companies that are exporters, it's very important to us. Some of the other things that we're seeing is that there are incentives being created in other countries for us that are creating a disincentive towards exporting. So, for example, China will give us a 15% export credit, and which we don't have in the United States, or they're providing these hidden incentives around shipping or raw material costs that are not making the headlines, but are definitely influencing business that's going on. The other issue that we're seeing are import duties, where there's if, for example, we see in some of our businesses, if China or France are giving us our advantages, whereas in the United States we don't see that, or they can import their goods here and not pay duties. Another thing that we would ask as an activity, which would be the anti-dumping process, which I know that the Commerce Department is the place that reviews that. It's very cumbersome and very difficult. We currently have a case, for example, where there's copper tubing dumping going on in the United States by China and Mexico. It's a 2-year process, a multi-million-dollar legal process for our companies to bring what is sort of obvious dumping going on. And in the meantime, while we're undertaking that fight, we're seeing the dumping continues. And so we're not, so it's a possibility to streamline that would be something that would be very helpful. These are just a few ideas of things that, we're seeing that might be areas for focus. And obviously, I think the final one I will end with is the notion of really creating strong incentives for us to continue innovating in terms of our automation and production in the United States, us developing patented technologies, which is ultimately how we're going to maintain our superiority in a global trade situation.
Thank you.
Charles, you want to get in on the high-tech side of things here?
Sure. Well, first of all, in the economy, we are seeing things pick up. The last, I would say, 2 quarters, we've seen an acceleration of our business after a tough 2009. And we announced about 2 months ago we plan to hire 2,000 people, and we're in the process of doing it now. So at least from where we're sitting anyway, we're betting on the come that this is going to continue. I would say for an export perspective, we're about 55% international. We have been for several years. We've doubled that over the last 5 years as well. The big market for us is Europe, but Latin America is growing the fastest for us. The one area I would say that we could use some help is on IP enforcement with intellectual property. So usually when you say that, people think of movies and music and all that. That's not what we're talking about. So almost any product you can think of over the next few years, it may look like a piece of equipment, but it's going to have a high degree of intellectual property content in it, whether it's security systems, handsets, you name it, robots, electrical transmission equipment. This is the information age, and more of the things that we make, even though you can touch them, the brains is going to be software, some sort of content. And that's an area where the U.S. has a comparative advantage, complex manufacturing of sophisticated products. It's sort of like Germany has its own chemical products. And so the problem today is, though, that can be reverse engineered in some markets, and that is happening. And so it makes certain companies reluctant to export certain types of products. And this is an area where small businesses can benefit a lot because they make specific components, circuit boards, or analog devices. They'd like to be able to license that technology to other markets, but you can't really do that if there's not patent protection. So I think over time, this is an area, our export as a percentage of what we export today is going to be more IP-based. It behooves us to try to create that protection, our understanding around the world. And I think there's a lot of empirical evidence as well that once you have patent protection in a country, the imports go up. And also the local importing country benefits because it develops a local market, knowledge transfer, production knowledge as well. And so over time, I think we have to convince these importing countries that it's good for them as well, and it's good for us.
One last thing here. There's been a great deal of discussion here. I think we know we're losing track of the fact that somewhere around 30% of the jobs that are associated with exports are in the service sector. And so while it's clear there's important focus on manufacturing and other things, service is an area in which we actually have a comparative advantage. I think those of us in the service-oriented sectors are really concerned that even trade negotiations, access is very important. For a number of companies, they're in a little bit of trouble providing a full range of their services overseas because of access issues in other countries.
I'm just curious, how do those usually manifest themselves?
They manifest themselves in ownership limitations. For example, if you're interested in providing financial services, there are clear restrictions on the range of consumer services that you can provide in some countries if you're a financial services provider. And there are obviously also issues about the repatriation of profits. But it is often very focused limitations on the kinds of businesses that one can provide overseas.
Laura, you?
Oh, sure. Let me continue the focus on technology then, because I think our real strengths, and I think they're well represented around this room in trade, are really in the knowledge and technology-intensive sectors, where we still have, despite growing competition, we still have the majority place in the world. 38% of our GDP. We have about 30% of manufacturing value added in the knowledge and technology intensive, and about 34% in services. We are the primary producer of this stuff. We have seen, however, our share of exports declining, absolutely declining on a regular basis. It's been particularly severe in the information and computers sector, and we have gone from a trade surplus position in high technology goods to a deficit, although we still have a trade surplus in services. Now, what does that tell us about policy? First of all, these sectors are really important not only because they're big in the U.S. economy, but because they have higher than average productivity, they pay higher than average wages, they have higher than average export intensity, they do most of the R&D in the United States, they have very important relationships with universities. So these are activities and sectors we really need to care about. I think what we know is that the rest of the world is focusing on getting as much of this as they can from us. And so when you ask, well, what can we do to keep it here? I think this is about your agenda in research and education. And I think we've talked about this in terms of a national competitiveness agenda, but you can see it very clearly in what you're doing in research and education. So I would say whether it's the goal of increasing R&D as a share of GDP to 3%, or significant increases in the funding for basic science, even when we're in a very difficult deficit situation, very, very important for this long-run competitiveness. I think, starting frankly with the race to the top, the K through 12, all the way through PhD student support. I mean, at every level, what you hear from companies over and over again, the two ways you compete in these fields are research and talent, and there's a kind of virtuous circle between them. The more you invest in research, the more you need talent. The more you have talent, the more you can invest in research. So I think that these initiatives are very, very important. I would add to the list of all of the education and research agenda that you've put in place, which I applaud, and the STEM, emphasis on STEM education, very, very important. Concerns about further efforts over time to retain foreign educated talent. I mean, after all, in most of the PhD level education in the United States in science and technology fields, we're at close to half, and in some cases 70% of the students who are getting these advanced degrees are foreign. Luckily for the United States, these students have wanted to stay, but we don't make it particularly easy for them to stay. So just like saying we need some visa improvement in terms of, say, businesses, a lot of business leaders will say it would be lovely to come up with a program which you had an automatic visa for certain kinds of degrees granted in the United States, instant, for some period of time, because companies can use them. I just saw, as I was walking in, the Wall Street Journal saying there's now aggressive already talent hunting going on in the high technology community. Okay, they will therefore hit the wall pretty quickly if that's the case with things like temporary H-1B visas. It won't be enough for them. So we need to have it to think very hard about immigration. And then I want to relate this to the broader issue of jobs, because I just saw, as I was preparing for this meeting last night, I'm making the case for education in terms of exports and technology exports. But the truth is, when you look at this unemployment rate, it's the no high school degree where you get 15% unemployment, the high school degree where you get 10. When you get down to the bachelor's degree right now, it's about 5%. I mean, unemployment in this country is an education problem, as well as an aggregate demand problem. And in every sector and in every occupation, what you see happening is the education levels of the jobs that are being created is rising. The jobs that are being destroyed, those are education levels that are not high enough to be competitive with the technology. So very, very important. And then finally, I will just put in also, because I've heard so much about it, the tax issue. I should say on the tax issue, we do have a subgroup of PERAB that will be reporting to you on this. So I will only just say what I hear on a repeated basis. Because we have the second highest statutory corporate rate in the world, we have a disincentive to invest from that. Firms that end up making investments abroad because they have to serve the foreign market or they get a huge capital grant from another government, then they face the other thing is if they make the investment abroad, then when they earn the profits abroad, they have a disincentive to bring them home. So you kind of have a twofer. You have a kind of incentive to make the investment someplace else, and then you have a disincentive to bring the profits home. So I agree with the notion of trying to come up with a balance, but I think from the point of view of the multinational companies, which account for about half of U.S. exports, half, this is an extremely important issue, and we have to get the balance right because those are the major exporters, and they pull along all of the small and medium-sized firms. So education, research, and taxes, I think, important to long-run competitiveness.
Thank you.
Mark?
I want to follow up on something that Marty talked about, which is the idea of a net export. So the big thing today is I believe we should start a public-private partnership that's a race for the top for American energy independence. Today, and every day, we spend about $1 billion on foreign oil, the better part of $1 billion. If you look at that over a generation and you NPV that's about $10 trillion. So we're spending $10 trillion over the next generation. What do we do about that? There's at least one good idea out there, I think, which is to figure out a way to electrify cars. We've spent $2 billion, this administration has, on batteries. So in the next few years, we're going to be leaders in battery technology. When you spend $2 billion, you're going to take a leadership position. But there's a real risk, I think, that we'll be a niche player. Because the reality is that our system is fundamentally not structured as well as some of our direct competitors on whether this works or not. So for example, if you're in Western Europe, you're spending $7.50 a gallon. So you get a real incentive to switch. You're not very mobile. You're in a small country. So you're more likely to switch. You've got one utility. There's one utility in most of these countries. We have 2,000 utilities. And you've already started a governmental process to put in place the infrastructure that's going to increase the likelihood that you're successful. So yesterday I met with a very senior guy at Sinopec. He controls 90,000 gas stations in China. Every new gas station he builds has to have a power outlet, has to have power outlets for their cars. And in China they've started, only really recently, 13 cities to have the infrastructure associated with electric vehicles. So those 13 cities are going to be able to allow them to do things that will be different than how our consumers will approach it. If you look at that, you say, okay, they have a higher price of fuel, they have better infrastructure, they have a policy in place to support it. What's the likelihood that in France, for example, where they've got one utility, EDF, they've got a national champion in Peugeot, Renault, which is really a leader in electric cars, what they're going to do is really push this. And so if we're not in a position where we figured out a way to compete with that, we're going to have leadership in batteries, but ultimately we won't have consumers buying cars. Now, we can't do this across the country, right? It's too expensive. And it's not absolutely clear how it's going to play out. But I think what we should do is take what we've learned in education and what I think Arnie and the team have done brilliantly and figure out a way to compete by region and say, I want to take X number of cities, I want to do a public-private partnership. There are a lot of big companies that are interested in this. You know, Walmart's interested in it. I'm sure that some of the companies represented here are interested in it. Anybody who's done transportation is going to focus on it. The utilities are focused on it. If you're a leading governor, you're going to want your PUC to get in line with this. And since you've got a crisis going on at the state level, you've got a real incentive for the states to do things they've never done before. So if you choose a handful of places to start it, then you're more likely, if you're focused on this, to make some progress. What's the multiplier on this? So you reduce imports, which is where Marty's all focused. You increase national security. You're not importing as many barrels. We had a discussion a couple of years ago now, why is oil $150? Remember oil was $150? Why was that? Because oil demand went up 5%. Really, it was a demand-driven event. If we could ever figure out a way at the margin to bring down the demand for oil, the elasticity should be, there are a number of economists here who can talk about this, much better than you'd think. Oil prices should come down, so you get a real benefit from it. And then if you say, okay, over a 20-year period, what's the likelihood we have what normally shocks the U.S. economy? It's not normally a financial crisis. It's normally that energy prices just spiked. So that $10 trillion doesn't assume anything about the likelihood of averting a recession as a result of figuring out a way to move out of the oil business. And then on climate change, it's got obvious positive ramifications, and on job creation, it's got positive ramifications. A lot of people talk about natural gas. I'm all for that. We've got a tremendous amount of natural gas. That's a great thing for this country. We may actually be able to produce more chemicals going forward, more steel going forward, more of a lot of things going forward because we've got cheap natural gas that we never had before, which is why chemical industry and other places have moved to wherever there's cheap money and there's cheap sources of natural gas. But if we ever did this where we electrify, then the market can figure out how we should generate electricity in the United States. Should it be carbon? If we put a price on carbon and do this, should it be coal sequestration, natural gas, wind, solar, biomass, nuclear, whatever it should be, they'll figure it out. But we'll have an infrastructure in place that will have proven once and for all whether the American people are willing to buy this. I think they probably are. I was an early investor in a company called Sirius Satellite Radio almost 15 years ago. When we did that investment, which had its ups and downs over a very long period of time, I can tell you, no one really knew whether all OEM manufacturers were going to put satellite radios in their car. Now everybody does. So it does take time. This isn't something that we should overpromise on. But if we did a public-private partnership where we said, over a generation, over 20 years, we want to create a situation where America can be independent of foreign oil, I think all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, people will get behind that.
Thank you.
I think, Mr. President, there's some uncertainty in energy right now, just on where it's going to go. It's keeping jobs from being created, and I think whatever it is, whether it's an extension of Energy Star tax credits or whether it's some kind of movement there, I think if you think about jobs in the next 18 to 24 months, that would be helpful, just to get some clarity around where that's likely going to go. And really, this is more lower tech, but if you had something like an extension on the Energy Star tax credits, manufacturing will come back to the U.S. quickly. That's a small, teeny tiny little point, but it's meaningful. It says you can make things here, and most of us now know how to make products with fewer, lean manufacturing and stuff like that can compete with China and Mexico. So all around the energy space, I think there's jobs that can be created just with some clarity.
Well, also within the energy space. It's not low tech either. It's high tech capability now to develop our natural gas resources and our domestic energy resources that will create a lot of jobs, and some clarity there I think would be very helpful.
You can't say we've lacked for imagination.
No, but this has all been extremely helpful.
John Doerr.
John, you want to chime in?
Right?
This is our least imaginative guy.
Yeah, least imaginative guy, John.
These points that have been covered are super important. I agree with you. I think the dimension to this that I want to bring is about innovation. Because in the long run, the only way we're going to increase export is for America to continue to be, and increasingly be, the most innovative nation in the world. And we're actually, I think, in good shape when it comes to the biotechnologies and the information technologies. And no surprise, we're not in good shape when it comes to the energy technologies, ETs. Over the last 15 years, the average U.S. corporate spending in the private sector on energy innovation has been 1/4% of their revenues. That contrasts within the biotech or the information technology sector of anywhere from 5 to 15% of revenues. And we're at a moment in time now where the advances of science, what we can do with the science of the small bugs, small materials, nanotechnologies, mean it's possible to innovate and develop durable advantages, better batteries, better renewable fuels, not from food. Another fast fact, federal R&D on clean energy is less than $3 billion a year. You contrast that with the NIH of $35 billion a year. And of course, you know this is why you called for $15 billion a year of R&D in clean energy technologies for the country. Where all that comes home is what happens in markets. And to make this innovation go on a recurring basis, we've got to have strong, robust domestic markets. We've seen a leading U.S. manufacturer of solar cells move its R&D operations to China, because that's where the markets are. The energy growth around the world is going to be around the world, not inside our country. I just came across this fact, and it should inspire us, I think, that 3 years ago, China had 2% of the worldwide solar market. And as of the fourth quarter of last year, those numbers are just out, their share has almost approached 50% of the market, while the U.S. share has gone from 43% to 16%. So what are we going to do about all this? We got to up our investment in energy R&D. And I can't come to this table and just say more. We got to find ways to pay for these things, because it's just as important that we reduce our deficits. So the very first meeting, the PERAB unanimously advised, recommended, and you have advocated some kind of comprehensive energy climate legislation that could fund, that could pay for substantially more R&D. And there's a lot of recommendations below that. But I just want that to be in our minds as we think about what we're going to do about exports. The proposal that you got leaders of Congress together in and around some sort of Kerry Lieberman Graham idea is a very promising way to go do this, and it's awfully important, I think. What's going on in the Department of Energy, I think, is quite exciting. Steve Chu, this is an A team. They're working very hard. The EARPA program made 37 grants, innovative programs. Most of our clean energy R&D today is in our national labs. I don't want to take a thing away from that. I want to close telling you a story about MIT. Susan Hockfield of MIT told me that fully a third of all the faculty at MIT wants to work on clean energy research. And the total amount of MIT's funding, federal funding for that work, is under $100 million, which is not enough to fund that degree of innovation. So I think we've got to innovate. And to innovate, we've got to invest and incentivize those investments. And if we do that, I think America could get its export mojo, its economic strength back.
Let me just, since energy has been a theme here, let me just discuss sort of how we're looking at this. This is one of these foundational priorities from my perspective that has to be done soon. As has been noted, there's been a good bipartisan discussion taking place within the Senate around a mechanism that would put a price on carbon and would also deal with some of the research issues and would renew some of those programs like Energy Star that are already working. The one thing I think is going to be very important is for the business community to weigh in on this in a significant way. I'd say just in terms of timing, financial regulatory reform will take several more weeks, and then we'll probably be transitioning next to look at what can be done on the energy front. The more business is out front, this is a business creator, the better off we're going to be. And look, part of what makes this difficult is it entails transitions, not just for the macroeconomy, but for the microeconomy. Individual industries are affected differently. There are regional impacts that are different. In the aggregate, I don't think there's any argument that this is not the right thing to do. But as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And so individual members of Congress may be worried about the implications, at least short-term, of some of these moves. And having assurances from the business community and having that messaged effectively that this is important is going to be critical to our success. But the vision that Mark, you, and John have both articulated is one that excites me enormously because I think it's inevitable. And I'm just generally big on getting ahead of change as opposed to having change happen to you, having change roll you over. And I fear that if we don't take these steps soon, that we're going to have some big problems. So.
You got a benediction and all this, Anna?
I do, actually. So thank you, Mr. President, for everything that you do, for your courage and your leadership. And I think that it's easy for the media to sometimes forget the challenges that you inherited when you took office. But the reality is across our country, millions of workers wake up every day in frantic panic about what's going on with them because they live the economic disaster every single day. And so I think that it's, and you took action by the Recovery Act, which actually kept people working and kept our states and local governments serving people. You took action by being a strong advocate for healthcare reform when we really needed you to be the one who shook heads and pushed people together to make this get done. And you have been standing up to Wall Street. And you talk about getting America going again, and your actions actually give people hope. But I just wanted to talk about the depth of the crises, because as we sit here talking about exports and making sure that it's a net job increase, and we talk about trade, and we have to talk about enforcement of dumping and other things, we need to figure out how we really get America going in a much larger way. And so when you think about the crisis is really deep. Laura talked a little bit about it. It is really deep across this country. When you talk about 9.7% unemployment, but you also talk about the number of people who are underemployed or have given up looking for jobs. For people who are looking for jobs, there are 6 applicants for every 1 job. And for people of color, it's even worse. And for young people, it's even worse. And as we try to think about the human suffering, we can think about individual suffering, but it actually has an impact on our society and our country, both in our communities and our society long term. And I think that we have to grapple with that and somehow get Congress's attention and our partners around us everywhere is attention to the fact that if we don't do something soon, that it's going to have a long-term impact on our society. And so when I think about what goes on with chronic joblessness, I can see Austin and talk about his awesome studies on young people. When young people out of high school don't have jobs, can't find jobs for a couple of years, the longer it goes on, the less likely they will find jobs, the more likely they will fall into drugs or illiberal behavior and give up hope. For young people graduating from college, and there still are some who are desperately looking for jobs, every year that they don't get a job, they're up against the next class who are coming out with white spaces on their resumes, and it holds them back not just for those years, but forever. Studies have demonstrated that they're held back for the rest of their lives in terms of earnings, in terms of advancements. And then when you think about people who give up hope on jobs and lose their confidence and can't find work and end up giving up, it has a huge impact on their families as well. And so I'll tell you a story. My father was a truck driver, and he was disabled when I was 9. And he ended up being eventually permanently disabled, but he frantically looked for work and couldn't get it. And then he ended up being underconfident, unhappy, and a difficult person to live with as we all grew up with him, because it took away that hope. That is what's happening in millions of homes around America. People are giving up hope. It's having an impact on domestic violence. And then when we think about our kids go to school hungry and they go to bed hungry. And I can't imagine being a parent and putting my kid to bed hungry, but that's what goes on. And when kids are hungry, they can't learn. And when they can't learn, they can't advance. And when they get out of high school, whether they make it through high school or not, they are left behind for a long time, forever. And so this crisis has an impact on our communities because high pockets of unemployment, especially for people of color, and in pockets in rural parts of America where factories have disappeared, it changes their whole communities forever. It changes the family structures. People don't get married. People get more divorced. Kids are in single families. So there's this problem that we all face. And I think that as we think about the human impact, not just of the individuals, but of our communities and what happens to our society long term, when people have lost hope, have lost the talent and the skills and the opportunities, it really has it's something that we have to grapple with. So my thing is, not only do we have to think about exports, we have to think about fast jobs. We have to think about how to put people together, put people to work today, and I want to do long-term too. I think that's really important to invest in energy. I really think it's important to create the new technology and the new industries for the future, but there are some things that we can do now that can take, especially pockets of high unemployment, and put people to work. And so, yes, we do need more stimulus for the states and local governments. We cannot have 900,000 jobs be lost across this country because state and local governments' budgets are hemorrhaging. Whether we can figure out some financial support for them, I think that we need to do that. Otherwise, people will be more desperate. And the services that will be lost are the actual services that people who are jobless and homeless need the most. And so it has a double impact. So I think we need to do that. The other thing there are ways to be able to put people to work fast. George Miller has a bill in Congress right now with 100 and some sponsors, and he's moving on more, which is about jobs for local governments that will be additional jobs in public services, but in private sector as well, that can get people going again. And according to the numbers, we can probably put close to 100 million people to work through his program. And those are basic skill jobs. You can take people out, give them basic skills. We also think that there needs to be a whole initiative on some of the services that are in high demand. Child care, home care are in high demand. There are a long list across this country of people who are in need of both of them. We can train people quickly to do those kinds of jobs, and those jobs go right into wages so people can spend it. And so it's actually good for our communities. And I do think that the whole issue of the greening of America, whether it's Homestar in retrofitting homes or Building Star in retrofitting buildings, can actually be another way of putting people to work quickly. Some of it will be short-term, and some of in Building Star, it actually needs to be done for a longer term as well. And those are all areas of employment. And I would also say that thank you for healthcare reform. But when we covered 32 million more people in America with healthcare, that means we need more healthcare providers, and we need to do it in a smart way. So to really, ratchet up the training for healthcare workers, whether they're community-based healthcare workers or nurses or nurse practitioners, there are all occupations out there that we need to recruit people. And we can actually begin by thinking about how do we retrain in high schools, and what do we really do in terms of giving people the opportunity to get from high school to college, some of these training programs. And so I do think that the last two things, I'll talk quickly. In terms of training, if we could really think about all the training dollars in this government and try to focus them on the new technologies, on the new industries, I think that we could get out of the 20th century and perhaps move into the 21st century in a faster way. And so for all the infrastructure and high-speed rail, I think that's all good, but that's really something that would go down the line. And so I think that we can, in fact, get America to work again. I think it's going to take a couple things. One is going to take you. We could not have passed healthcare reform without you. Your strong voice in forcing the Senate particularly to come to the table and understand that they could not walk away from healthcare. I think we have to somehow force them to understand that they can't walk away from America. American families are desperate. In every single Senate seat across this country, people are desperate. And somehow we have to bring the urgency to that Senate. And I also want to commit to you that we also need to put the field in motion too, because we have to get the people who are frustrated with the joblessness and the big financial institutions together again to understand that we can solve this problem.
Mr. President, could I just, because I think jobs are your toughest grade, but I'm not sure how much indeed you can actually do about it. Capital exists. Cash exists.
We got to get it off the sidelines.
We got to get it off the sidelines. And so your self-confidence, your belief in the system, your sense of optimism is what we need. It's your toughest grade, but in the end, how much you control philosophically will differ around this table. But I can tell you, corporations have never had as much cash as they have today.
And it's not just corporations; it's a global phenomenon.
And we got to get it. We got to get it back to work in this country, and that's what's going to create jobs.
Well, the confidence is a good stimulus, and it's relatively cheap. And so part of what makes obviously me confident is when I hear business leaders like you, Jeff, and Jim, and others saying, you see opportunity out there, and you want to put it to work. Now, Anna, I want to address directly what you said. This entire export initiative is all designed to make sure that those families who are so desperate and write to me every day are starting to see more opportunity. And so I'm not interested in exports just for some theoretical reason. I'm interested so that Jim can hire, instead of 3,000 more folks, he's hiring 5,000 more folks. And the suppliers then are hiring 15,000 instead of 10,000. And that then means that they're paying taxes, which means that the local and state governments have the funds to not lay off teachers, and we get a virtuous cycle. So I'm very mindful of this. Obviously, there's a broad debate that's taken place, and has been taking place over the last year and a half, which goes to Marty's point, which is, how do we balance a huge hole in the economy that was created as a consequence of the financial sector, making sure that we're stabilized and we're growing again, while keeping an eye on the fact that we've got these long-term deficits that really can be crushing and could end up being a huge impediment to growth in the future. I think so far we've struck the right balance. And I think that there are some selective areas where I still think we can make a difference. For example, every business leader here should be concerned about the fact that you've got states now that are going to 4-day school days, or school weeks, because they just can't afford it. And so, as concerned as we are about deficits long-term, until states and local school districts are getting their tax base back, and that tends to be, that lags even the tax revenues of federal governments. I don't think it's acceptable for us to be sending our kids to school for 4 days a week. So one of the things that we're looking at is, are there ways where we can get some immediate help to those state and local districts around education? Because it actually undermines the good work that we've done on Race to the Top. If you've got a whole bunch of schools that are interested in innovating and demanding greater teacher performance and this and that and the other, except they can't afford to pay teachers, then we've got problems. So I'm very mindful of that our immediate work, our short-term work of lifting folks out of the terrible crisis that they've experienced in very human terms, that is ongoing. But this is one of those situations where we've got to do two things that at times are contradictory. We've got to be focused on the short term, but we've got to keep our eye on the medium and long term. And so even as we're making sure that unemployment benefits are out there and COBRA continues and we're providing states and local governments with help, we've got to be thinking about how are we getting this energy sector cranking, how are we protecting intellectual property, how are we training the next generation of engineers and scientists. Those are all things that we're going to have to do now in order for us to be successful. This has been a very useful conversation. I appreciate it. I want to remind everybody that in terms of follow-up, Gary Locke and Fred Hochberg are going to be calling you incessantly and asking for your advice, your counsel, and giving you reports about how we're implementing effectively. All right?
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you. Thank you.